Well, welcome everybody. We'll begin this session. We're very pleased now to hear from Stephen T. Collis. He's an attorney at Holland & Hart. Stephen's the chair of the Religious Institutions and First Amendment Practice Group at Holland & Hart, as well as a member of the firm's complex civil litigation and employment groups. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, where he teaches courses on the intersection of law and religion. Mr. Collis publishes and speaks regularly on religious freedom issues and represents religious and other institutions in a variety of complex matters, including in the United States Courts of Appeals for the Ninth and Tenth Circuits and the U.S. Supreme Court. So we're pleased now to hear from Stephen.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay with the microphone? I got too loud of a voice for that. How about this? How's that? Better? All right, if it's not loud enough, just shout out. This is going to be a very interactive session. We've got people running microphones. I'm hoping that we can all work together. They introduced me with my professional background. I'll tell you the standard self-deprecating joke to start off with about myself. So when I was 9 years old, I was going to camp, summer camp, and it was the 80s, so having spiked hair was really cool. And I got mousse and I put it on my hair. I spiked my hair up. I looked really awesome, and I walked out of the bathroom. And as I was walking out of the bathroom, my mom walked by at the exact same moment, and she stopped, and she started sniffing, kind of like a dog. She said, "What is that smell?" And I said, "It's the mousse." And she went, "Oh my gosh!" And she spun me around and she rammed me into the sink and started washing my hair out. So it turns out what I thought was mousse was actually Nair. And all of my hair fell out that week at camp, and everyone thought I had all these problems. So there you go. With that icebreaker, I had this presentation prepared some weeks ago, but yesterday Elder Wickman said something that was too compelling, and I had to add it to this front slide. He said, "I sometimes fear that we have relied too much on the Constitution instead of doing the hard work of being a citizen." That resonates perfectly with what we're going to talk about today, and that's kind of the whole theme that we have here, is how to do the hard work of being a citizen. I'm going to talk a little bit about some few crucial issues and points of guidance, and then as a group I want us to talk about what can we do to help promote religious liberty, and how can individuals be involved long before lawyers are involved and something's going to litigation. We really can't promote religious liberty until we actually define what it is, mostly because it's really hard to promote something if you don't know what you're promoting. And in my experience, people who try to promote religious liberty without knowing what it is often end up doing more damage than good. I won't say often, but a substantial group of people end up doing more damage than good. And we see this in a lot of areas. We see people that are promoting what they perceive as religious liberty only for themselves. In other words, they're promoting a policy that only applies to their religion and that 5 minutes of time, and that's really what they're advocating for. We see it from, in the state legislatures right now, we see with these RFRA statutes, these were discussed yesterday, it's the Religious Freedom Restoration statutes that are trying to get passed in various state legislatures. And what we see consistently is Republican lawmakers on one side getting up and promising that the statutes do something that they don't do, which then causes Democrats on the other side to get up and oppose the statutes, not because of what they actually do, but because of what the Republicans said they do. And so you've got both sides fighting about something when the statute doesn't even do what everyone's fighting about. We see situations where many people who purport to support religious liberty are actually pushing for policies that do harm to other religions. The ban on Muslims is a perfectly good example of that. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but can you imagine if someone had proposed a ban on Christians or a ban on Mormons, how outraged we would be? And yet we see the vast majority of support for the Muslim ban is coming from people of faith who in other contexts are arguing for and even begging for religious liberty. And then refusing to compromise on anything. Again, people who really understand religious liberty and understand where it comes from understand that there's a necessity for compromise on the legal side. There's never a necessity for compromise on doctrine. But there is a way to reach compromises on legal protections, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Here are some examples of just some of the stuff that you see in the media, this is just from a couple days ago, that the support for the proposal to ban Muslims is, from entering the country is upwards of 70% now. The vast majority of that 70% are evangelical Christians. It's doing more harm than good, and part of that comes from trying to protect their own interests. And it's understandable they want to be safe, but in the context of throwing out religious liberty with it. So we need to understand what religious liberty means. And what I want to give you is a very general definition that you can apply in any circumstance you're in. It stems from the First Amendment and from the religion clauses. So the first clause in the First Amendment that deals with religion says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is the language where our notion of separation of church and state comes from. It's the idea that the church cannot establish any type of government religion. There are other people that have tried to interpret it differently, but none of that's gained any traction, and certainly the only definition that, or the only interpretation that's ever had any lasting meaning is that government should never try to establish religion. The second religion clause says that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So the idea is that government cannot do things that would prohibit us from living our religions the way we want to and practicing our religions the way we want to. What that means is, and where the scholarly debate has kind of settled out, at least for most scholars, certainly there are scholars who disagree with this, but it's the doctrine known as substantive neutrality. It's different from facial neutrality. Facial neutrality is if a statute is facially neutral. That means it applies to everybody, it's not meant to discriminate, and it applies to everybody, then it's facially neutral. That means, however, that it's not substantively neutral. And let me explain why. When substantive neutrality rules the day, government does nothing to promote or hinder religion, and you define religion very broadly. In my view, everyone is religious. Everyone has made some type of religious choice. But this religion even includes atheism and agnosticism for these purposes. So what that means is that if you have a law that applies to everyone, it's neutral and generally applicable, in order to achieve substantive neutrality, that law then needs to exempt out religious practices that would be burdened from the law. The best example and the easiest example to think of is prohibition in the 1920s. So you ban all alcohol. Well, if you just let the law stand at that, what that would mean is that for Catholics, they could no longer have their communion, which is the most sacred ordinance they have. And for Jews, you could no longer have the Passover Seder. Both of those require wine. Now, when Prohibition was passed, there were exemptions, both for Catholics to have communion and for Jews to have the Passover Seder. That then achieves substantive neutrality, where the government is not putting its hand on any type of exercise of religion, okay? The second bullet point relates to the Establishment Clause, and that ensures that government is not using its power to promote any form of religion over another form of religion. And again, that includes atheism or agnosticism. Now, the most obvious example for this today would be direct funding to a church. And I mean direct funding to a church to do its ministerial duties. So paying a pastor and having the pastor as a government employee would be the government promoting one religion over another. So the test that you want to apply in any given situation, if you're in your local communities and you're looking at a situation and you're trying to decide if something threatens religious liberty, you want to ask yourself, in this exact scenario, is government promoting religion? In other words, is it promoting one religion over another? And define religion very broadly. Or two, is it hindering the free exercise of religion? Even if the law seems totally neutral and generally applicable, is it hindering the free exercise of religion? And I'll tell you, I was just in a debate with some legal scholars the other day, and the consensus we came to was that more often than not, laws hinder the free exercise of religion not because of bad intent, but because people just aren't paying attention. They're not sensitive to the minority religions out there who they may be burdening when they pass a particular ordinance. And they need somebody to come and make them sensitive and to explain the issues. So that's what we're talking about here. When substantive neutrality rules the day, what that means is that religions and religious philosophies rise and fall on their own merits. Okay? You get converts, you lose faithful members, you gain faithful members, people come and go based on the merits of your teachings, of your example, of the spirit they feel when they're in your churches and in your synagogues. That's what makes the difference for various religious beliefs, not whether or not government has interfered at all. And that's what you're trying to achieve with substantive neutrality. I will tell you I mentioned facial neutrality. Facial neutrality is currently the constitutional law of the land, at least under the federal constitution. So many of you, if you just came from one of the other talks, probably already know this, and I apologize for that, but just real quickly, in the early 1990s, Justice Scalia in the U.S. Supreme Court in a decision Employment Division versus Smith basically said that if a law is neutral and generally applicable, it does not violate the Constitution, even if it burdens the free exercise of religion. So what that would mean is that prohibition in the 1920s would be constitutional under the federal Constitution, even if it meant that Catholics could not do their Holy Communion and Jews could not do their Passover Seder. So the good news, though, is that the same opinion essentially said, look, if states, though, want to allow those exceptions, or if the federal government wants to allow those exceptions and put in religious exceptions, it can. That's fine. It's totally constitutional to make sure you protect all religious people. It's just not required. Now, I don't agree with that decision. I think substantive neutrality should rule the day. But nevertheless, we're at a place right now where if things get to litigation, courts are going to be applying the rule from the Smith decision in a lot of cases. Okay, here's a few guiding principles, and then we're going to get into some hypotheticals together. But the first question you always want to ask is, are you promoting religious liberty when you take a position on something? Does your position promote freedom of religion? And you can ask the two questions I just asked. Is government hindering free exercise, or is government promoting one religion over another? And you can always ask that question to try to get at the heart of whether or not your opinion on a particular matter is actually promoting religious liberty or not. Secondly, always keep in mind that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You don't want to sacrifice the broader principles of religious liberty for something you perceive as being a short-term gain. The Muslim ban is a great example. I understand completely why someone would say, well, let's just ban all Muslims because that way we can be safer and we don't have to worry as much about terrorist threats to the United States. The problem is you're setting a precedent there. If our nation and our Constitution allowed the absolute ban of an entire group of people simply based on their religious affiliation, that means that could apply 20 years from now when Mormons aren't popular to Mormons, or to Christians, or to Baptists, or to Jews. That's a perfect example. You don't want to say, well, I want to be safe now, so I'm going to throw out religious freedom in the interest of being safe. You've got to find a way to get to being safe without sacrificing our most crucial things. Always ask how you would be affected by any type of policy. So you always want to put yourself in the shoes of the people that are being affected and say, how would this affect me? That'll often help you get to your answer. Finally, I've got a good friend that I work with a lot in my practice in Colorado, who is a very faithful, devout rabbi. He's also very, very liberal. He tends to look at all of this religious liberty stuff as nonsense. And we were on the phone the other day, and he said, well, my religious liberty isn't being burdened. Excuse me. To him, that was the end of the conversation. Well, if my religious liberty isn't being burdened, what do I care? Well, the reality is, if anyone's religious liberty is being burdened, then everyone's religious liberty is being burdened, because any policy that can be used against someone else can be used against you. It happens all the time, and so you've always got to be aware of that. Finally, a theme of this conference, and it's even in our Fairness for All slogan there, is looking for compromises. And there's two reasons for this. First of all, being willing to compromise on legal doctrine and on what the law is just makes sense. It makes for better dialogue. It allows you to open up for possibilities and find better solutions than you might otherwise find. More importantly, it's practical. I was just on a call the other day with some legislators who were trying to get something done, and you had the LGBT side on one part of it, and you had the religious freedom side on the other side. The religious freedom side tried to pass a RFRA bill without any compromises, and that just got shot down. The LGBT side came in and tried to pass an LGBT rights bill without any compromises for religious people. That just got shot down. And the reason they contacted me is they both contacted me together. These two people advocating for two different bills contacted me together. They said, we just realized we can't get anything done unless we work together. That's true in almost every area related to religious liberty, is finding compromises that work. The Constitution is a good example. For lawyers in the room, I apologize, but for non-lawyers, the Constitution was a compromise document. They had to find a way to hold the colonies together and to come to some kind of an agreement. So one of the major compromises, there were a lot of them, but one of the major compromises was slavery. Slavery was enshrined in and protected by the Constitution until the end of the Civil War. That was one of the compromises they had to make in order to make the country as a whole stay together. It was a horrible outcome for many, many, many years, of course, but it was what they had to do. Compromise is part of reaching good solutions and getting to a better outcome. Finally, it's very much important to know your rights and to know the rights of others. So once they're infringed upon, you can know when to get involved and when to jump in. And that's what you're doing by being at this conference. I encourage you to not let the education stop here. Continue to explore and understand these things. Continue to understand your rights and the rights of others. So with that said, we're going to jump into some hypotheticals, and I very much want to tap into the collective wisdom in this room. We've got a lot of people with a lot of experience in here from a lot of different walks of life. All of us are going to think of things that other people have not thought of, and my hope is that we can share with each other ideas that I couldn't come up with on my own and that any one of you couldn't come up with on your own, but together we can really inspire each other to know what to do. And we're going to walk through some of these hypotheticals, talk about ideas, and I don't want you guys to think that there are any right or wrong answers. There aren't. I really want to hear what you have to say. So we've got, where are my mic runners? I've got one here and up there. I think he's already, unless you want to go take it from him. All right, you got it. Okay, wonderful. So here's our first hypothetical. And by the way, if you don't raise your hand, I'm just going to call on people, so be ready to share your ideas. First off is, no religion in schools. You live, let's pretend now, you live in a school district or you've got a family member. I realize many of you are from Utah, so this may not happen in Utah so much, but let's say you've got a family member somewhere else and the school district decides that they are terrified of violating the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So they decided they're just not going to allow any religion in schools whatsoever, and they say they're going to pass a rule that doesn't allow students to pray over their food at lunchtime, as private or individuals, and that students caught offering prayers are punished with detention or even suspension. And they are also saying that students are not permitted to discuss their individual religious beliefs on school property. Now, for you lawyers in the room, you'll probably recognize this as a hybrid claim. There's religious liberty, but then there's also free speech. I'm going to take the free speech part of it out of it for now and just focus on religious liberty. So the very first question is, does this threaten religious freedom? Way at the top. Sorry to make you run all the way up there.
It's good for me.
Yeah, you'll get a good workout. And if you could provide an explanation, does it threaten religious liberty, and then why?
Okay, now I think there was one other participant here who also had a hand. Hopefully we'll say about the same thing, and that would be that, the state is not able to establish and promote one religion over the other. But at the individual student level, they are free to do things, even though there may be some confusion, especially among the adults, about if that's allowed or not.
So that's a good point, and we can go back to our definition of substantive neutrality, right? Prohibiting students from doing this is prohibiting them from exercising their religion. It's hindering the exercise of their religion. Allowing them to do that is not like the school is promoting one religion over another. They're just saying, hey, all of you students, you can do what you want as far as your religion is concerned. We're going to stay out of it. Here, arguably, what they're doing is promoting, you might argue, like a secular religion over a religion that requires prayer to a God, right? And so it violates it in a number of ways. Where was the other hand?
I was about to say just about the same thing. The students do have the right to do that if it's student-oriented and student-directed.
Great. So let's get to the meat of this then. We know it threatens religious freedom. How can you get involved? You're in your school district. You see this happen. What are you going to do? How are you going to get involved? We have someone down here.
Well, I'd say start by going to the school board, because chances are that they didn't pass this with the intention of targeting religion. They're probably concerned about lawsuits, Establishment Clause, and they think, chances are, because most people are trying to be reasonable, they think that they're creating an environment that is safe for students who aren't religious. So go and express the concerns that you have for your children and see if you can work something out there first.
Okay, so that's great. So we can go to the school board. And I like what you just said there. You hinted at something that came up in the last session, which is figuring out why they passed this. What is their concern? What are they trying to get at? And then you can talk to that concern directly, right? Instead of going in there and pounding on the podium and start screaming at people, you come in and what were you trying to do here? Why did you pass this rule? And then you can have an open dialogue about it. So that's great. Talking with your school board. Oftentimes it works to bring a group of people with you. I will say you getting in and screaming at the school board is not a good idea. That's mostly what school boards hear. And here we go.
I think talking to the school board is good, but I think the least obtrusive method is usually the better way to go. If you have a friend who's on the school board, talk to that person individually rather than in open forum, and try to get the thing done privately rather than in an open forum, I think is often better.
And isn't that so true? When we call out someone on some policy in public, oftentimes they're going to have a hard time with it. They're going to get defensive. They're going to want to impress people, especially if it was a lawyer who advised the school board that they should do this. If you call out that lawyer in public, that lawyer is going to be, say it's the general counsel for the school district. They're not going to want to embarrass themselves in front of everybody. They're going to dig in their heels. But if you can find out who made the decision, who advised the school board, and talk to them in private, you may be far more likely to meet some progress on that, right? Wonderful. What other thoughts do we have? What else would you do over on this side? Actually, you know what? The woman right in front of you had a comment, and then we'll come down to this gentleman. Thank you.
I was just reading a book called The Washington Hypothesis. I don't know anyone who's read it, but John Adams' mother was talked about in there, and how she taught him to be a revolutionary, how she taught him to have a passion inside of him to stand for the things he needed to stand for. And if our children are allowed to direct their own lives in that direction, then we certainly can inspire them.
All right, so inspiring the students to get involved with something like this, right? The students can petition the administration. The students can petition the board. The students can do their own ways of drawing attention to it. That's wonderful. I like that. Encouraging the students to do something. Hi.
I have the impression that even internationally, almost all constitutions provide for freedom of religion. But the definition of freedom of religion is missing. And even in our country, I think, and in our own society, a lot of people interpret that as being freedom to believe whatever you want. And everybody's in favor of that. But there's another half to it, and that's the freedom to exercise your belief, or to have activities in conformity with your freedom. Sometimes that just needs to be pointed out, because people aren't always thinking of the dual meaning of freedom of religion.
So let me riff off that a little bit. You make a good point, and you said it in a very kind of non-threatening way, and that ties into precisely what you want to do in these situations. You want to go in and speak civilly, right? You want to explain what the law is, what is allowed and what's not allowed. This violates a number of Supreme Court cases, and it violates the Constitution, and it violates a number of state laws. And you want to go in and explain in a very civil way what the problem is, why it's an issue, the fact that it's infringing on students' rights, and do it in a way where you're not going to get people angry. I was just telling folks in the last session, a very good friend of mine is the general counsel of a school district in Colorado. They passed some bill that parents were upset with. Instead of going in and engaging in a civil dialogue, a bunch of parents created a bunch of tombstones with the school board's names on them, including my friend who's the general counsel, and went and jabbed them into the ground in the yard in front of the school building. That's not really very productive, right? You want to engage in a very civil way. I see a hand way at the top up there.
I agree with everything. So far, as a school board member, I would say there's a second step. It often, maybe not here in Utah, but where I live in other places, it often occurs that if you have a school board member who understands and relates to religious freedom, they may be in the minority, and the majority of the school board may not understand the meaning of it. And so that first dialogue that you have with a school board member is also an opportunity for you to find out from that person, and I think this applies to any board, even licensing boards, et cetera. Find out from them if they are going to be able to take care of it, or if they're outnumbered either by the staff's opinion or the board itself. And there's a second step that can be taken. And in our school district a few years ago, a parent came to me because there was another board member that wanted to start allowing rated R films in classrooms, and some of the parents felt that that was infringing on their ability to control what their children received, and perceived it as a religious liberty issue, and came to me, and I shared with her the dynamic of the board at the time, and it was actually an LDS member of the board who had proposed to let the rated R shows in, which would have been the only other ally. So the step that parent took was then to share the information and let other parents know, and the school board office subsequently received 1,100 emails in 24 hours. And that expression of the community's will, of the community's attention to that issue, it wasn't necessarily wholly civil or calm, but it was very effective. The board just dropped it. They didn't want that. Having received all those emails, they didn't want to fight that fight in public, they decided. And so there is the ability and I think sometimes the imperative to go ahead and mobilize one another and let people know what the nature of the dialogue is going to be if they dig their heels in.
Before you give up the mic, let me ask you a follow-up question. I love that. I'm so grateful that we have a school board member here. That's the whole point of opening this up for the dialogue. How did she get everyone involved? Did she do it through Facebook? What methods did she use to let everyone know what was going on so that they could mobilize and act?
She emailed her group of friends and asked them to email their group of friends, et cetera.
And it just spread.
Yeah, and
Wonderful.
it was very, very fast. It actually crashed the school district's email system.
Great, and that's a wonderful example of how people can get involved quickly and address these things long before it ever gets to litigation. Let's move on to another hypothetical. This also deals with schools, so I'm not going to talk so much how we can address the schools, but I do want to get your mind thinking about how different ways these problems can come up. A local school district decides to allow teachers to lead prayers and Bible study in schools as part of required class time. On the face of the policy, students are not required to participate, but those who refuse often face disfavor and derogatory comments from teachers and other students. Does this violate religious liberty? You're vigorously nodding yes. Do you want to explain why you think that? Yeah. Sorry.
Well, if, say, a Muslim student was a student who was in that school and they're facing disfavor and derogatory comments from that, although the Christians are exercising their right to, well, I'm assuming it's a Christian, that may not be the case, but anyways.
They are reading the Bible, so it's
I'm assuming.
somewhat likely.
But yeah, so they're exercising their right, I guess, in that case. But A, it's required class time, which is that the state is essentially establishing a religion. And second of all, even though this other student doesn't have to participate, they're essentially being discriminated against because they are opting out of it.
Okay, great. Yes?
Also, I think you've got the problem that the teacher is actually leading the prayers as opposed to allowing students to pray during time that might be available.
Right, so you have an authoritative figure, right, with the government stamp of approval and authority on them leading these prayers, and then also leading a scenario where students are feeling to be ostracized if they don't participate. Okay? We have any other thoughts way at the top? If you can wait for the microphone, that'd be great.
Okay. There's the option of allowing both to lead a prayer. I mean, one day one could lead a prayer, the other, giving all religions the opportunity to pray in their way, thus teaching, the great differences and likenesses of religions.
Okay, there's a compromise possibility, and then right here. And we're still on the question of, does this threaten religious liberty?
Yes, just because it's establishing. But I think if you had a time where each of them could privately do what they want and not feel like they're pressured by the public schools to conform to a certain religion. I know in town hall meetings and different things like that, they take turns having Muslims lead prayers, or Jews, or Christians, and they rotate, and they allow for that kind of religious diversity. I think that could be some sort of solution to go along with hers.
Right. And I'll tell you just right now, I'm going to move off of this hypothetical because, to be honest with you, there are endless variations of what could happen. And some of these questions get very, very difficult to answer. But one thing I'll tell you, this was an actual case. It came to the U.S. Supreme Court in the year 2000. It took place in Texas. It was a predominantly Baptist school district. They allowed teachers to do this. There were 2 students who felt like they were being ostracized and punished for not participating. One was a Mormon, and one was a Jehovah's Witness. They eventually got to the point where they had to bring a lawsuit They were afraid that they were going to get retaliated against, to the point that they got permission from the court to file as John and Jane Doe. The school district actually aggressively tried to figure out who filed the lawsuit. And it percolated in the courts for a number of years before finally getting up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court struck this down. Now, the fact pattern that once it reached the Supreme Court had changed dramatically because the school kept trying to change what they were doing. But the reality is this does impinge on religious freedom, and it does pose problems. And you had a teenage 13-year-old LDS girl feeling as though she was being punished and ostracized because of this scenario. I want to move on to hypothetical number 3. This is zoning for a mosque. So let's pretend you live in an HOA. There's a dilapidated rec center in your neighborhood. No one's used it for years. And eventually a Muslim congregation comes and purchases it, and their goal is to fix it up. They want to make the rec center a combination of a pool and racquetball courts and places, a basketball court, places for kids to play, but then also a mosque area so that the Muslim youth can come there after school and be playing, but then still retire to the mosque for prayer time because they have prayer multiple times a day. The HOA, a number of members of the HOA is putting up resistance, including the leadership of the HOA, and they're trying to get the zoning board of your county to oppose the mosque and to not approve it. Without the zoning, the mosque will not be able to operate. And the Muslim congregation itself, this mosque and its imam, they do not, as far as you know, openly condone any of the extremist violence that we see in the news and that maybe even some of us have experienced, but they don't condemn it either. They've never come out and made a public statement against it. You hear about this. This is all you know. What are you going to do? Well, first of all, does what the HOA is trying to do threaten religious freedom? And if you don't want to answer that, you don't have to, but since you raised your hand to the other question. But
Well, ultimately whether or not it threatens religious freedom is going to depend upon the intentions of the HOA. Why are they trying to keep the mosque out? Is it based on the fact that it's a mosque, or is it based on something else, like maybe it'll bring in more traffic and they don't want to deal with more traffic? So you have to figure out what their intention is first before you can figure out if it is a threat to religious freedom or not.
So I love that you said that. I'm so glad you said that. This hypothetical elicited a similar response in the last session, which is exactly what I was going for. You've got to know more, right? You've got to answer. You've got to go out and ask questions. And that is crucial for all of these conflicts. Don't rush to opinions on things before you know all of the facts. We do that way too much in every area of our lives. It's so important to figure out, why is the HOA acting this way? What are their concerns? How can we address those concerns? And then you might find out that it really is just kind of blatant discrimination, or even if it's somewhat rational fear, you can at least get to it so you can have a dialogue, right? So you've got to figure out what all the facts are and then go from there. Let's say that it comes pretty clear that the HOA is doing this because most people, they just don't want to have a Muslim mosque right in their backyard. They're terrified of it. They're worried that there's going to be some ties to terrorism, and that's just what they've decided. Now, what they're going to argue to the zoning board is not going to be that. What they're going to argue to the zoning board is traffic, lights, too many cars. We don't want to have to deal with kids running around screaming all hours of the night when they're playing at the rec center, all that kind of stuff. But another part of the fact pattern is that any other church like this would get approved. Okay? So what are you going to do once you reach that scenario? Over here.
Thanks. Yeah, we just moved from Meridian late last year down to Utah, and we kind of experienced some of this with the church putting a temple in Meridian. And it was interesting, the process that was used. There were a lot of people that were opposed to the building of the temple and the location. There was a lot of neighbors that rose an issue to the city council, the county zoning board. And the church's approach was really cool. It was more a matter of building community awareness, getting the opinion leaders together, and having a dialogue. Ultimately, it was approved, but it wasn't this is our right to do it, and you're going to deal with it. It was let's talk about the impact. Let's reach out to where, to the extent that we can. Let's highlight the fact that it's going to raise property values and different things. I think sometimes the conversation shouldn't be as much of, this is my right versus your right, as much as this is our community, and how can we best build it to include include each other and be sensitive to each other's interests.
So absolutely, an excellent answer, right? It doesn't always, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this session, is it doesn't have to be about coming in and challenging people on a constitutional level or civil rights level. It can be going around and figuring out what concerns are and trying to reach a consensus, trying to build a consensus among opinion leaders within the HOA, so that when you get to the zoning board, you can talk about it in a rational way and people won't be so fearful, right? Okay, great. What other steps could you take in this scenario? You're in the HOA and your neighbors are obstructing this right here.
This is a little more reflective. Sometimes I question my own motives. I might have an initial impulse that I'd rather not have a mosque down the street. My parents live in a neighborhood where the school was no longer needed. The building sat idle for a long time, and they built a different school there, a private school. But as you've been talking, I asked myself, what would I have felt if I heard that they're going to build a mosque down at the bottom of the street in my parents' neighborhood? And I might have had a knee-jerk reaction to that for some reason. I've got a lot of good Muslim friends and hold them in high regard. But sometimes we've got to start with a little bit of soul-searching on ourselves and sift through our attitudes, our values, our motives to make sure we really got this thing right. Because more times than I'd like to admit in my own life, I've had opinions that over the years have changed. I thought for sure I was right earlier on, and now with passage of time, I'm just not quite as sure on some things. So I guess that's I'd say is almost a first step, is to really think through it and make sure we're seeing it clearly. Another just a comment, as you put this hypothetical up, two analogies came to mind. One was the Boston Temple, where zoning ordinances were used to prevent them from putting the steeple on the temple.
Right.
And at least from my perspective, it seems that was driven by hostility towards the faith more, and that all of the other things were raised were just red herrings, but maybe we tend to do that. I also thought of the Savior, where in the trial before the Sanhedrin was based on religious crimes, blasphemy, etc. And yet when they pitched it to Pilate, they pitched, the way they pitched was changed to try and sell it to the authorities who were making decisions. And so I see that in my own life in two ways. One is to make sure that my motives, my vision, my understanding are correct, and to make sure that I'm advocating truthfully as to what my concerns are, not having hidden concerns and then expressing others, but being honest with myself and with those that are being advanced. Then to make sure that we never use our religion in a way that is persecutorial of others. Maybe our opposition at times could be, if we think in a spiritual context, maybe improper in the sight of the Lord, so to speak, in the way we're going about things altogether. So these are just, as I've been reflecting, I'm kind of looking inward more than anything here, and so I thought I'd share those.
Well, I thank you for that. There was a hand way up at the top in the white shirt and tie, and as he's going up, I thank you for that. How important it is to look inward and ask, why are we doing something? And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier of not wanting to do more harm than good, right? We need to really look at what our motives are and then also think about the legalities of it and ask, why are we doing what we're doing? And that's a huge part of it. Okay, up there.
I think that everything applies to everyone. The question is, does that threaten religious freedom? It does. Why? Because if that HOA is opposing or resisting the building of a mosque, they can resist also the building of a meeting house from the Mormon Church or the Catholic Church or anyone. And so you gotta look at it that it applies to everybody what that HOA is doing. So we have to be very careful with that.
Absolutely, and that goes back to one of my earlier slides about what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right?
Exactly, and I'm not an attorney, but you have the RLUIPA, or the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that takes care of that for any religion.
Right, and now our goal today is to talk about what we can do as citizens before it gets to that, but you can raise RLUIPA with the zoning board, right? If you've got HOA members who are challenging this, you can come in as a fellow HOA member and say, now wait a minute, we're violating any number of laws here if we don't allow this mosque in, especially when we don't have good reasons for it, right? Okay, I know we've got other hands. Well, let's do one more right here in the blue shirt and red tie. He's getting his calorie burn for the day.
Imam Musri offered a great example this morning of getting people from different faith communities and traditions together and discovering common ground and commonality. If you're in a position in a situation like this to invite the HOA leadership, to invite the leadership of the Muslim congregation to sit down together, they might find that they have a lot more in common than they think, and you might find that the HOA leadership softens a bit.
You know, I'm so glad we stuck on this so you could make that comment. This is actually a fact pattern from something I've dealt with from one of my clients. My client was a Muslim congregation. They were dealing with this exact situation. When I first went in there to meet with the imam and talk with them about the scenario, I was amazed at how similar what he wanted to do is to what we do in the LDS church for those who are Mormon, and most churches, quite frankly. He wanted to have a place where his youth could have good and uplifting activities. He wanted to have a place where they could engage in worship. He wanted to have a place where they knew they could be safe instead of being out on the streets and getting in trouble. It was all the same motivations that almost any religion has when they try to build a building. And to your point, if you bring in members of the HOA and you have that conversation, they start to realize, wow, he's just trying to do exactly what we would want to do. And suddenly those barriers start to fade away. So reaching out to the mosque and talking with them, wonderful. And it doesn't have to be a mosque. It doesn't have to be Muslims. It could be any religion. Here's another hypothetical. This is related to a Supreme Court case that I recently worked on. A state is considering passing a law requiring pharmacists and pharmacies to stock and deliver certain types of drugs, including abortifacients. The law applies to everybody. There are absolutely no exceptions, not for business reasons, not for anything. What that means is that even conscientious objectors cannot get exempted out of it. So if your religious belief is that handing out this pill to someone that you believe is an abortifacient is equivalent to giving somebody a gun to go kill somebody, you still wouldn't have an exception here under this law. So first of all, does this threaten religious freedom? We have one hand here.
I think if there is, in fact, no exceptions for any reason, then it would be neutral and generally applicable, so it would not threaten religious freedom.
So let me ask you this. Okay, I'm going to call you out on that.
Okay.
Don't get mad.
That's fine.
You're right that it's constitutional. This law that I've suggested here is constitutional because there are no exceptions whatsoever. It would pass the Constitution's First Amendment test. You're right. But does it threaten religious freedom?
Yes, it like coercing someone to do something against their religious belief.
Yeah, and it's government hindering religion, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I point that out, this matters, because what I'm talking about here is a state is considering passing this bill. It hasn't passed yet. Now you're right, if a state passes this bill and we wait until it gets to the courts and lawyers like me litigate it all the way to the Court of Appeals or whatever, we're going to lose probably. But we're not at that stage yet. We're at the very beginning. And the state's just considering passing it. We know it threatens religious liberty because what we're telling these pharmacists is, hey, you either violate your sincerely held religious beliefs or you lose your career. That's a big price to pay. It's a huge burden for government to place on someone's religious free exercise, right? So the question is, how can you get involved? We're talking about a state level bill that the state is trying to pass. How can you get involved here? I'd love to hear from any and everyone. Up at the top again.
So I have another story for you about really effective parents. In Nevada, there was a proposal to change the sex education law so that Planned Parenthood would teach the sex ed classes to the kids. And it was a bill like this, so it was in the legislature, and the parents became aware of it and felt it was a threat to their religious freedom because they knew the agenda that was going to be taught was definitely contrary to what they wanted their children to learn. So there were two different things that they did. One was a group of them traveled to the legislature and met with everyone they could get an audience with, every legislator, and kind of found out who cared, who found meaning in their concern, and began to work with them and find out what those legislators needed in order to prevail in trying to defeat that bill. And then they also, again, mobilized parents to send emails, both to those legislators who were on the side of the religious freedom issue, and also to those who opposed it, just to generate awareness of where the community was on the issue, and that it would not be a quiet passage of the bill if they were to pass it, to make sure they knew it would become controversial. And then in working with the legislators who sympathized with them, these parents learned from those legislators what they could do to help them, and they did those things. So it was a matter of forming relationships with the legislators who they found to be sympathetic with their religious freedom concerns. And they actually did defeat the bill.
Excellent. You know, what you just described there sounds like it sounds like a lot of hard work. And what it reminds me of is the quote that I had at the beginning from Elder Wickman, that for many of us it's time to start doing the hard work of being a citizen. And that means taking the time to go to the legislature, taking the time to talk to people who are in the know, taking the time to figure out what you can do, how you can help. If you're in a situation where you don't even know, you don't have the first clue how to deal with a legislature, well, one of the things that I like to tell people is none of us is more than maybe 2 degrees of separation from the President of the United States, quite frankly, right? All of us, I think, are probably 1 degree of separation from someone who knows how the state legislature works, whatever state you're in. And you can talk to people and ask questions. What can I do? Where can I go? How can we mobilize people? Very quickly, you'll find somebody who has some influence, who knows what to do, who will show you where to go, and you get the process moving with the state legislature. Okay, what else can you do?
Hey, Steve.
He's bringing the mic to you. Hold on.
I don't really need it, but...
Well, we need it for the video to pick up.
Okay. Steve, I'm opposed to this kind of a law, aside from the religious issue, because I don't believe that the state should force any business to sell something it doesn't want to sell. Because it takes the freedom away from that pharmacist. I mean, you know, that's an issue too. And if I want to have an abortion, and my next door drugstore doesn't sell me this particular thing, I don't mind going 2 or 3 blocks down the street to buy it. What good grief. They got laws and laws and laws and laws. You got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do that. And all because somebody doesn't want to go 2 or 3 blocks and look for somebody, because there will be a drugstore that will sell that item in the, you know, it's not like it makes it unavailable. It's just that drugstore doesn't want to sell it. Okay, I'll go to another drugstore.
Right. Okay. Wonderful. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. We've got more hypotheticals, but I want to move on to a quick video that kind of emphasizes some of what we talked about, gives some other ideas of things we can do. Many of you may have seen this video from last year. I'm not showing the whole thing. I'm showing a small portion of it that is explicitly related to what we're talking about in here today. I apologize if you've seen it before, but my hope is that it will open your mind to other things you can do in your local communities as these issues arise. After this video, we'll talk about one more thing that all of us can do, and then wrap up our session.
You know, I would encourage everyone, no matter where they are, no matter what station of life they're in, no matter their educational background, to educate themselves on the issues in the defense of religious liberty. They need to know why it's so important, what the challenges are, and to become aware of the local issues in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities, in their own cities. When those issues come up, they're there, they're ready, and they're able to respond in an informative way.
They can do that through op-eds. They can do it by giving talks at Kiwanis Club. They can do it at the auxiliaries of any of the churches. They can teach. They have that experience. They can teach the principles of religious freedom throughout the country.
Religious leaders and believers must unite to strengthen our freedom to teach what we have in common, as well as to teach and exercise our very real religious differences. We must walk shoulder to shoulder on the same path in order to secure our freedom. We must also insist on our constitutional right to exercise our beliefs and to voice our conscience on issues in the public square and in the halls of justice. These are the rights of all citizens, including religious believers, leaders, and organizations.
I think what the case actually has stood for is that religious liberty and religious freedom is not dead in America. That these are still issues that courts are not only willing to take seriously, but they're willing to defend. And that gave me hope. It gave me real hope. To have that unanimous decision, that basically told religious organizations and entities throughout the country is that, you know, if this is an issue that you hold dear, you know, fight for it. You know, fight for it.
So there's another little clip, but we don't have time to look at it. I just want to emphasize what it talks about. The clip talks about how religious freedom is losing esteem in a broader social context. I think one thing you guys will learn today, if you haven't learned it already, is that legally in the United States we're pretty well off with religious liberty, especially compared to other countries. But in a social context, religious liberty is losing esteem. It doesn't take long for that loss of esteem in society to translate over to a loss of rights in the courts. The question is, what can we do, all of us in here, to increase that esteem? And it ties back into the purpose of the religion clauses. One of the purposes of the religion clauses was to reduce religious conflict. The founders were coming off of decades, if not centuries, of religious warfare. They were trying to find a way to make that go away, and the religion clauses helped achieve that. Another part of it, though, relates to Montesquieu, who had a tremendous influence on the founders. And Montesquieu taught that virtue was an incredible and important part of a free society. If people were going to govern themselves, they needed to have a certain modicum of virtue to be able to do so effectively and to do so successfully. And religion was at least one way for that to happen. My concern today is that too many people don't see the virtue coming from religion. They see religion only as a negative, as an institution and institutions who are doing nothing more than trying to challenge other people's rights, to prevent other people from living the way they want to, instead of seeing all the virtue. This notion that religion provides virtue is something that has been a theme in the United States going back really to the founding. And this next little clip you'll hear is from a voice probably familiar to many of you.
I sought for the key to the greatness and genius of America in her harbors, in her fertile fields and boundless forests, in her rich mines and vast commerce, in her public school system and institutions of learning. I sought for it in her democratic Congress and in her matchless Constitution, but not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great.
Now, I don't want to get into today about the question of whether or not religious liberty leads to virtue or whether or not the founders all believe that. That's not really the point of this. The point is, how do we help other people understand that religious freedom is a good thing, that it provides virtue? How do we get there? How do we broadcast that virtue to the world? Unfortunately, we don't have time to open this up to the group, and I wish we did, but we're almost literally out of time. What I want to emphasize to you, though, is that these are just some news stories that I saw this morning, okay? News stories about local churches out there serving and doing good. We don't see enough of this anymore out there in the zeitgeist. All we hear about is churches opposing this and opposing that and yelling at people for this and yelling at people for that. These are the types of things that need to be shared on social media. And I put up all of these various social media logos because that's where the social dialogue is occurring. That's where people are forming their opinions on things. They don't even realize it's happening. They're just scrolling through Facebook and they're seeing various headlines and things that their friends post, and they're forming opinions. And part of the opinions they're forming is that they're losing esteem for religious liberty. We need to change that tone, and it's something all of us can do. We've talked about meeting with legislatures and challenging zoning board commissions and meeting with HOAs. Those are all things that you may or may not have an opportunity to do, or quite frankly, you may end up telling yourself, I'm way too shy to do that. But this is something that everyone can do, and they can do it immediately. A great example comes from the LDS Church. This is something that they posted yesterday at 6:30 in the morning. It simply says, pick a simple way to serve today. Often it's the small acts that mean the most. Tag a friend and challenge them to do the same. That's a simple post from the LDS Church that shows virtue coming from religion, and that any number of people who follow that can immediately spread out on the internet to all of their own feeds so other people will see it. Regardless of how you are able to get involved in all the other scenarios we talked about today, I would encourage each and every one of you to do everything you can to go forth into the world and with humility show the good that is coming from your faith. Thank you.